On December 15, 1952, President Harry Truman lit the national Christmas tree on the White House lawn. As he pressed the button, 6,500 colored lights illuminated the towering Norway spruce, while a crowd of thousands sang Silent Night in unison. Churches across America rang their bells simultaneously, and radio stations coast to coast broadcast the ceremony live. This wasn't just a holiday tradition, it was a moment when Christian faith and American civic life moved as one unified force. Fast forward exactly 70 years. In 2022, the same ceremony happened, but something fundamental had changed. The tree was now called a holiday tree in many contexts. The crowd was smaller, more diverse in faith backgrounds, and the event competed for attention with countless streaming services, social media platforms, and secular entertainment options. The bell still rang from some churches, but many Americans didn't even know the ceremony was happening. What happened in those 70 years wasn't just a shift in holiday marketing or political correctness. It was the quiet dismantling of a 400-year-old foundation that had shaped everything from how Americans viewed marriage and family to how they conducted business and governed themselves. This is the story of how Christianity lost its grip on America's moral compass, not through dramatic persecution or sudden collapse, but through a series of cultural earthquakes that few saw coming and even fewer understood as they happened. The numbers tell a stark tale. In 1952, 91% of Americans identified as Christian. By 2022, that number had plummeted to just 63%. But the real story isn't in church attendance statistics. It's in how profoundly this shift has rewired the very DNA of American society, creating a nation that would be virtually unrecognizable to its founders. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time when the line between Christian faith and American identity was so blurred, they seemed like the same thing. Hey everyone, welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the historical forces that shaped our world. If you're new here, we explore the fascinating stories behind major cultural transformations. And speaking of transformations, I'm curious, where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know what profession you're in. I love seeing our global community come together around these big historical questions. The story begins in 1620, not with the Mayflower's arrival at Plymouth Rock, but with what happened next. When William Bradford penned the Mayflower Compact, he wasn't just creating a governing document. He was establishing a template that would echo through American politics for centuries. The compact began with the words, "In the name of God, Amen," and its signers covenanted together for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith. This wasn't mere ceremonial language. These settlers literally saw themselves as building a city upon a hill, a phrase John Winthrop used that would later be quoted by presidents from John F. Kennedy to Ronald Reagan. But here's what most people don't realize. Winthrop's sermon wasn't just inspirational rhetoric. It was a binding social contract that assumed Christian morality would be the operating system for everything that followed. For the next 300 years, this assumption held remarkably firm. When the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, Delegate Benjamin Franklin, hardly an Orthodox Christian himself, called for daily prayers because, as he put it, "The longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men." The Constitution they created never mentions God explicitly, yet it was written by men who assumed a Christian moral framework would fill in the gaps. Consider this fascinating detail. When Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, establishing how new territories would become states, Article 3 declared that religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. The religion they had in mind wasn't Buddhism or Islam, it was Protestant Christianity, pure and simple. This Christian foundation wasn't just theoretical, it shaped everything. Sunday blue laws closed businesses and banned entertainment on the Christian Sabbath. Blasphemy laws made it illegal to speak against Christianity in public. Marriage was defined as a Christian sacrament. Divorce was nearly impossible, and adultery was a criminal offense in most states. Public schools began each day with Bible reading and prayer, and students memorized the Ten Commandments as naturally as they learned arithmetic. The First and Second Great Awakenings in the 18th and 19th centuries only strengthened Christianity's cultural dominance. These weren't just religious revivals, they were massive social movements that touched every aspect of American life. The Second Great Awakening alone, which peaked between 1820 and 1840, gave birth to the abolition movement, the temperance movement, women's suffrage, and dozens of social reform organizations, all explicitly grounded in Christian theology. By 1850, foreign visitors to America routinely marveled at how thoroughly Christian the culture was. French observer Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, "There is no country in the world where the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America." He wasn't just talking about church attendance. He was describing a society where Christian assumptions about right and wrong, proper behavior, and social obligations were so universal they seemed like natural law. The high watermark came in the early 20th century. In 1920, Christianity wasn't just America's dominant religion. It was the lens through which most Americans interpreted everything from personal relationships to international affairs. The prohibition of alcohol, passed as the 18th Amendment in 1919, represented the peak of Christian moral authority in American law. Here was an entire constitutional amendment based on the Christian belief that alcohol consumption was inherently sinful. But even at this moment of apparent triumph, cracks were already forming in the foundation. The first hairline fracture appeared in the most unlikely place: the courtroom. In 1925, the Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee seemed like a victory for Christian traditionalism when John Scopes was convicted of teaching evolution in violation of state law. But the trial's real impact was in how it was covered by national media. For the first time, millions of Americans watched as defense attorney Clarence Darrow made fundamentalist Christianity, represented by prosecutor William Jennings Bryan, look foolish and anti-intellectual on the witness stand. The trial didn't change any laws immediately, but it planted a seed of doubt about whether Christian morality was compatible with modern scientific thinking. Suddenly, there were two ways to view the world: the traditional Christian way and the modern scientific way. This intellectual crack would eventually become a chasm. World War II accelerated the process in unexpected ways. Military service threw together Americans from different religious backgrounds like never before. Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish soldiers served side by side, and many came home with a broader, more pluralistic view of what it meant to be American. The Holocaust also raised profound theological questions about divine justice that traditional Christian answers couldn't easily address. But the real earthquake began in the 1960s, and it started in the most mundane place imaginable: the Supreme Court. On June 25, 1962, the court handed down its decision in Engel versus Vitale, banning school-sponsored prayer in public schools. The prayer in question wasn't even particularly Christian. It was a bland 22-word invocation that read, "Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country." But the court ruled that even this minimal acknowledgement of divine authority violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. The decision shocked Christian America. Here was the Supreme Court declaring that the country's founding assumptions about God's role in public life were unconstitutional. Cardinal Francis Spellman called it a tragic misreading of the Constitution. Congressman Frank Becker proposed a constitutional amendment to overturn the decision, gathering support from 167 House members. But the court was just getting started. The next year, in Abington School District versus Schempp, they banned Bible reading in public schools. In 1973, Roe v. Wade legalized abortion nationwide, directly contradicting Christian teaching about the sanctity of life. Each decision chipped away at the legal framework that had supported Christian moral authority for centuries. Meanwhile, popular culture was experiencing its own revolution. The Beatles arrived in America in 1964, and John Lennon's 1966 comment that the band was more popular than Jesus, which sparked outrage and record burnings in the American South, turned out to be prophetic in ways no one imagined. Television programming began featuring content that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. Movies pushed boundaries around language, sexuality, and violence that Christian moral codes had previously policed. The sexual revolution of the 1960s struck at the heart of Christian moral teaching. The introduction of the birth control pill in 1960 separated sexuality from reproduction, undermining traditional Christian arguments about the purpose of sex within marriage. The counterculture movement explicitly rejected Christian moral authority, with influential figures like Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg promoting Eastern spirituality as an alternative to Western Christianity. But perhaps the most devastating blow came from within Christianity itself. The death of God theology, popularized by theologians like Thomas Altzer and Paul Van Buren, argued that traditional concepts of God were no longer relevant to modern life. When Time magazine put "Is God Dead?" on its cover in 1966, it wasn't just reporting on a theological debate. It was documenting a cultural shift that left millions of Americans wondering whether Christian faith was compatible with modern life. The impact was swift and measurable. Between 1965 and 1975, mainline Protestant denominations lost over 1.5 million members. Catholic Church attendance dropped from 71% in 1963 to 54% in 1975. Seminary enrollment plummeted, and thousands of priests and ministers left their vocations. More importantly, the moral authority that Christianity had exercised for centuries began fragmenting. Issues that had been settled by reference to Christian teaching, marriage, sexuality, business ethics, social responsibility, suddenly became matters of personal opinion and political debate. The 1970s brought new challenges. The rise of feminism directly confronted traditional Christian teachings about gender roles and family structure. The environmental movement offered a secular framework for moral thinking that didn't require religious faith. The human potential movement promoted self-realization and personal fulfillment over the Christian emphasis on sacrifice and service to God. By 1980, American Christianity found itself in an unfamiliar position, fighting for influence rather than exercising it. The rise of the religious right, symbolized by Jerry Falwell's moral majority, represented an attempt to reclaim lost ground. But the very existence of organizations like the moral majority proved how much had changed. Previous generations of Christians hadn't needed special interest groups to advance their moral vision. Their vision was the cultural default. The 1990s and 2000s brought accelerating change. The internet created alternative sources of moral authority and community that bypassed traditional religious institutions. Globalization exposed Americans to other religious and philosophical traditions on an unprecedented scale. Same-sex marriage went from being virtually unthinkable to legal nationwide in just 2 decades, despite overwhelming opposition from traditional Christian churches. The data tells the story starkly. In 1976, 94% of Americans believed in God or a universal spirit. By 2014, that number had dropped to 89%. More telling, the percentage who were absolutely certain God exists fell from 71% to 63%. Among Americans under 30, only 68% believed in God at all. Church attendance follows the same pattern. Weekly attendance dropped from 42% in the 1970s to 36% by 2018. But these numbers mask an even more dramatic shift. Among those who do attend church, many no longer view it as the primary source of moral guidance. A 2019 Pew Research study found that only 45% of Americans believed religious leaders should have significant influence on political and social issues. The decline hasn't been uniform. Evangelical Protestantism has held its numbers better than mainline denominations, and certain regions, particularly the South and rural areas, remain strongly Christian. But even in these strongholds, Christian moral authority has eroded. Young evangelicals are increasingly likely to support same-sex marriage, environmental action, and other positions that contradict traditional Christian teaching. What's emerged in Christianity's place isn't another unified moral system, but a fractured landscape of competing authorities. Some Americans now look to science for moral guidance, others to personal experience, still others to political ideology. Social media influencers shape moral opinions in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Corporate value statements and celebrity activism provide moral leadership for millions of Americans who have abandoned traditional religious institutions. The transformation shows up in unexpected places. Corporate America, once deferential to Christian moral sensibilities, now regularly takes positions that conflict with traditional Christian teaching. When Target announced in 2016 that transgender customers could use bathrooms matching their gender identity, the company was signaling that progressive values trumped Christian moral concerns. When the NFL supported players kneeling during the national anthem, they chose social justice activism over the patriotic Christianity that had long defined American civic religion. Legal changes have followed cultural shifts. The Supreme Court's 2015 decision in Obergefell versus Hodges, legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide, would have been unthinkable without the prior erosion of Christian moral authority. Justice Anthony Kennedy's majority opinion explicitly rejected religious arguments against same-sex marriage, writing that marriage equality was required by dignity and autonomy, secular concepts that superseded traditional religious teachings. Education has been transformed as well. Public schools that once began each day with Christian prayer now celebrate diversity and inclusion as their highest values. Sex education curriculum routinely contradicts Christian teaching about sexuality and gender. History classes emphasize America's failures, slavery, Native American genocide, environmental destruction, rather than its role as a Christian nation. Higher education has become actively hostile to Christian influence. Faculty at major universities are overwhelmingly secular and liberal, and Christian perspectives are often treated as unwelcome relics of an unenlightened past. Students graduate with worldviews shaped by postmodern philosophy, critical theory, and scientific materialism, intellectual traditions that explicitly reject Christian claims about truth and morality. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated trends that were already underway. When governments classified churches as non-essential and forced them to close while keeping liquor stores and marijuana dispensaries open, the symbolic message was clear. Religious faith was no longer considered vital to American society. Many Christians who complied with closure orders did so reluctantly, recognizing that their acquiescence further undermined claims to moral authority. Perhaps most significantly, the moral language itself has changed. Americans once debated whether certain behaviors were sinful or righteous, categories that assumed divine moral authority. Today's moral debates center on whether actions are harmful or beneficial, inclusive or discriminatory, progressive or regressive, secular categories that make no reference to divine command or religious tradition. This shift has profound implications. Christian morality was rooted in absolute truths, revealed by God, and interpreted through scripture and tradition. Secular morality is provisional based on reason, science, and democratic consensus. Christian morality emphasized duty, sacrifice, and eternal consequences. Secular morality emphasizes individual rights, personal fulfillment, and temporal outcomes. The result is a society where moral certainty has largely disappeared. Without a shared religious foundation, Americans increasingly live in separate moral universes, with different assumptions about right and wrong, different authorities for moral decision-making, and different visions of human flourishing. Before we continue, I have to ask, what do you think has been the most significant factor in this transformation? Are you someone who sees this decline as positive progress, or do you view it as a cultural loss? I'm genuinely curious about your perspective, especially given your profession and background. Also, if you're finding value in these deep historical dives, consider leaving a super thanks. It really helps us continue producing this kind of detailed content that takes weeks to research and script. The implications extend far beyond church attendance statistics. America's founding assumptions about governance, law, and social organization were built on Christian foundations that no longer exist. The founders assumed that external religious authority would constrain individual behavior and make limited government possible. As John Adams famously wrote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people, It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Without that moral and religious foundation, American society has required increasingly complex legal frameworks to regulate behavior that was once governed by internalized Christian principles. The explosion of federal regulations, administrative agencies, and legal precedents represents an attempt to accomplish through government control what was once achieved through religious self-discipline. The family structure has been particularly affected. Christian marriage was understood as a permanent, sacred covenant that created stable foundations for child-rearing and social organization. As Christian influence waned, marriage became a temporary contract based on mutual satisfaction, easily dissolved when circumstances changed. The divorce rate skyrocketed from 9.2 per 1,000 married women in 1960 to 22.6 in 1980. Single parenthood, once stigmatized as morally problematic, became normalized and even celebrated. Economic ethics have changed as well. The Protestant work ethic that once drove American capitalism was grounded in Christian beliefs about stewardship, calling, and eternal accountability. As those beliefs faded, they were replaced by secular notions of self-advancement and material success. The result has been increasing inequality, corporate irresponsibility, and the financialization of everything from education to healthcare. Perhaps nowhere is the transformation more visible than in American attitudes toward truth itself. Christianity taught that objective truth existed, was revealed by God, and could be known through scripture and reason. This epistemological foundation supported the scientific revolution, democratic governance, and rational discourse. As Christian influence declined, relativistic philosophies gained ground, arguing that truth was subjective, culturally constructed, or simply a matter of power dynamics. The consequences are visible everywhere. Political discourse has become tribal rather than rational, with different groups operating from incompatible assumptions about reality itself. Scientific authority is questioned not through better science, but through appeals to personal experience and political loyalty. Educational institutions struggle to maintain standards when the very concept of objective knowledge is disputed. Social cohesion has suffered as well. Christianity provided a common moral vocabulary that enabled Americans from different backgrounds to engage in meaningful dialogue about shared problems. Without that vocabulary, political and cultural conflicts become increasingly intractable. Each side speaks a different moral language, making compromise and cooperation nearly impossible. The rise of identity politics reflects this fragmentation. Without a unifying religious narrative that transcended racial, ethnic, and economic differences, Americans have increasingly organized around narrower group identities. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s could appeal to shared Christian principles about human dignity and divine justice. Today's social justice movements operate from secular frameworks that often view Christianity itself as a source of oppression rather than liberation. International relations have been affected as well. American foreign policy was once guided by concepts of Christian mission and divine providence that, whatever their limitations, provided coherent principles for global engagement. Today's foreign policy operates from competing secular frameworks, humanitarian intervention, economic interest, democratic promotion, realpolitik, that often conflict with each other and provide little guidance for complex international challenges. The decline of Christian influence has coincided with rising rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, and drug addiction. While correlation doesn't prove causation, the timing is striking. As traditional sources of meaning and purpose have weakened, many Americans struggle to find direction and hope. The secular alternatives, personal fulfillment, professional success, political activism, often prove inadequate for providing deep, lasting satisfaction. Yet the story isn't simply one of decline and loss. The weakening of Christian moral authority has also eliminated some genuine sources of oppression and injustice. Racial segregation was often defended on Christian grounds. Women's subordination was justified through biblical interpretation. LGBTQ Americans faced discrimination that was explicitly grounded in Christian theology. The decline of Christian influence has enabled progress on these fronts that might not have been possible otherwise. The scientific advancement that challenges Christian authority has also brought tremendous benefits: medical breakthroughs, technological innovations, and deeper understanding of the natural world. The pluralism that has replaced Christian cultural dominance has created space for other religious traditions to flourish and contribute to American society. Religious freedom itself may be stronger now than when Christianity dominated. The founders intended to protect religious liberty, but their vision was limited by their Christian assumptions. Today's more secular legal framework may provide better protection for non-Christian faiths than the old Christian establishment ever did. The question facing America today isn't whether Christianity will regain its former cultural dominance. That seems highly unlikely given current demographic and cultural trends. The question is what, if anything, will replace it as a source of shared moral authority and social cohesion. Some Americans hope that secular humanism will provide a new foundation for moral consensus. This philosophical tradition, rooted in Enlightenment rationalism, emphasizes human dignity, individual rights, and rational ethical thinking. It has already influenced American law and politics significantly, providing intellectual foundations for civil rights, environmental protection, and social welfare programs. Others look to science and technology as sources of moral guidance. They argue that empirical research can determine what behaviors and policies actually promote human flourishing, making religious authority obsolete. This approach has gained ground in areas like criminal justice reform, public health policy, and environmental regulation. Still, others believe that democratic deliberation itself can generate moral consensus without requiring religious foundation. They point to successful social movements that have changed American attitudes about previously contentious issues through persuasion, activism, and political engagement. But each of these alternatives faces significant challenges. Secular humanism struggles to explain why human dignity and rights matter without religious grounding. Scientific approaches to morality often conflict with deeply held human intuitions about justice, mercy, and meaning. Democratic deliberation works best when participants share basic moral assumptions, precisely what America has lost. The result is a society in profound transition, caught between a Christian past that many have abandoned and a secular future that remains unclear and contested. This transition explains much of the political polarization, cultural conflict, and social instability that characterizes contemporary America. Understanding this historical transformation is crucial for navigating America's future. Whether one celebrates or mourns the decline of Christian moral authority, everyone must grapple with its consequences. The institutions, laws, and social arrangements that govern American life were built on foundations that no longer exist. Rebuilding them, or replacing them with something better, may be the defining challenge of the 21st century. The story of Christianity's declining influence on American morality is ultimately the story of modernity itself. The long, complex process by which traditional sources of authority give way to new forms of knowledge, power, and social organization. Other societies have undergone similar transitions with varying degrees of success. Some have found secular alternatives that provide stability and meaning. Others have descended into chaos, conflict, or authoritarianism. America's path forward remains uncertain. The country that once confidently proclaimed itself a Christian nation now struggles to define what it means to be American at all. The shared moral vocabulary that once enabled democratic discourse has fractured into competing dialects that often seem mutually incomprehensible. The religious traditions that once provided meaning and purpose for millions have been replaced by secular alternatives that many find inadequate. Yet this period of transition also represents an opportunity. Americans today have unprecedented freedom to choose their own moral frameworks, spiritual practices, and life purposes. The diversity of perspectives that has replaced Christian dominance creates space for creativity, innovation, and growth that was impossible under the old system. The challenges facing contemporary America, climate change, technological disruption, global inequality, may require new forms of moral thinking that transcend traditional religious categories. The outcome of this great transformation isn't predetermined. History is full of societies that successfully navigated transitions from religious to secular authority, and others that failed catastrophically. Much depends on whether Americans can develop new sources of shared meaning and moral consensus that provide the social cohesion necessary for democratic governance. What seems certain is that there's no going back. The cultural, intellectual, and technological forces that undermined Christian moral authority continue to operate and accelerate. Whatever emerges to replace Christianity's role in American society will need to be adapted to 21st century realities rather than 18th century assumptions. The next chapter of American history will be written by those who understand both what has been lost and what might be gained in this great transition. It will require the wisdom to preserve what was valuable in America's Christian heritage while building new foundations appropriate for a pluralistic, scientific, and globally connected age. That story is still being written, and you are part of it. The choices made by this generation about morality, meaning, and social organization will shape America for centuries to come. Understanding how we got here is the first step toward determining where we go next. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most significant cultural transformations in American history. These are the kinds of complex, nuanced topics that we love exploring here at Professor Archive, because understanding our past is essential for navigating our future. If this analysis helped you see this transformation in a new light, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe. It helps us reach more people who are interested in serious historical inquiry. And remember, if you found real value in this deep dive, a super thanks goes a long way towards supporting the research and production time these videos require. What aspects of this transformation do you think will be most important for America's future? Let me know in the comments below.